A lot of similar things to what you guys called rchain.github.io, and we called it developer.rchain.coop. So there's a big overlap between the kinds of documentation you talked about and what we talked about around releases. But I think you should come up and talk about how there's sort of established norms that you're happy to follow up on.
Yeah, sure. So a lot of this is kind of like repeat from yesterday. I use this to write. So from the video game industry, use lots of references to that. One of my favorites is Riot Games. If you go to their page, you can basically memorize what it looks like. They have get started right on the front page. By the way, this is developers.riotgames.com. Then they have their full API reference, API. And then they have just the communities tab here. That's if you just want to get right into it. But then they have a little sidebar here, and this is how I think we can structure things when we have a developer site, which I think is really important, is at the very top they also have this coming across with community again. And these are the same communities I'm plugged into, which is Discord. We already have one, so we know that. Twitter, Gitter, GitHub, Telegrams. They don't have that, but we should. And then they have a couple of like API contests here or whatever. They do like, I don't know, like 2017 contests or whatever for, they have little events. Then, sorry, it's a little messy. At the top here, they also have the API itself. And if you click into here, it just goes to your sidebar, tells you how the API works. It's kind of like an easier to comprehend example of the documentation that you guys were just talking about. Where was just speaking, Iton. I'm thinking about the third part. Oh, then they have a status. We went back and forth a lot about this, and we think timeline's kind of a difficult thing to attach to, and it puts us in kind of a box. So I like how they do it. They just have a status. Like for example, they have like a tournament API, and whatever their API status is, they just have a green, yellow, or red little color here to tell you where it's at. And I think it's a safer bet for us to do instead of saying, November 2017 or something like that. So essentially, I'd just like for us to have a site like this. Initially, Nash, when I talked about doing the storage part of this, we don't want it on this part of this developer web page, mainly because storage is not going to be, I guess, what was it? We thought it would be one portion of it and not the entire representation of RChain. So
it's like people come here, are they going to expect to see blockchain stuff and not see blockchain because it's only storage?
Right. So the storage one, initially, we stick to GitHub. I'm happy to help with documentation, how we write it, to make it a little bit easier to read. But I'd like to have a full developer site like this on RChain. So this RChain with these components. Another thing I like to have too here would be, and it could be embedded within the community's events and meetups or whatever. And we can have different channels of how we're communicating or meeting up there. Yeah, so this is the main idea how I'd like to have us to have a splash page. I think this is really important. Like I said, Firebase.io, if you guys ever check that out, they have some of the best developer advocates, some of the best developer outreach I've ever seen in any software company, and they follow a format like this. It's really easy to plug into. So past just the site, on these different channels, we'll need someone that's managing it. I don't know if it's going to be me. We'll need probably a team at some point. But when people have questions, there needs to be someone monitoring all these different sites that has some developer chops. Usually it's a developer advocate, which is a software engineer, usually undergrad or whatever, and they also have some sales experience or business experience. But we'll need someone monitoring this, so if people have questions about it, they can come here and talk to someone that can at least talk to the developer to answer their questions as they're building on RChain. So developer advocacy is really important here, as well as with all these events and whatnot. Here, depending on how much bandwidth we have, I know we have software developers that can already write, and I'm happy to help as much as I can, as well as anyone else we bring on, but I think it's important we think about bringing on some, where's the eraser? Technical writers. Because the more we scale, the less bandwidth the developers are going to have, and the more we're going to need people kind of doing this part of the front focus of RChain Co-op. So, what else do we talk about for community outreach?
To some extent, finding our audience where they already are.
Yeah.
So, in particular, for the storage stuff, Nash talked about if you search for Scala database, what do you find? what forums do you find? Make sure we're visible there, or if you find search for Mongo or high performance database or whatever.
Another thing we talked about too, to go on to that, is universities plugging in. I'm in Austin. It's a pretty big tech community, so I know I can at least do that, is speaking to professors, either if it's going to be just to talk about what we're doing, or people that want to build on the project, or it sounded like they were talking about more along the lines of embedding it within the language and teaching them how to use the Rolo language. Sounds like you want to say. Yeah. So, did you want to say something?
One of the things that occurs to me about the architecture that we're developing is that the tools at different levels in the architecture are going to be usable independently of the blockchain. So one of the things that you sort of hear from Greg a fair amount is about how different components, change the state of the art in different ways, right? So Rolang is independently useful as a virtual machine without Casper. The storage layer is independently interesting without any of the other blockchain stuff involved. And so one of the places where you guys can have a lot of influence in terms of how we go to the open source communities and helping us understand when to keep them separate as products and when to roll them up under the RChain blockchain brand. Like when does it make sense to release separately and when doesn't it, right? Because obviously you don't want to overload the community with too much stuff that's not blockchain related. At the same time, you don't want to hide all your goodies inside the RChain node so that people can't get at them effectively to use them in interesting ways.
That fits with the whole decentralization idea, right? These are all the network of pieces, right? But people should be able to use them in ways we never thought of.
Right. So just because we've been working on storage long enough, it was the piece that came up first. And for what it's worth, when I envision what it means to release the storage layer as an open source product, it doesn't have, the people who would consume it are going to be open source database developers. People who want to build database applications, not necessarily people who are interested in blockchain. And if you're going to market to those guys, you have to be careful to make sure they understand what they're getting. And so that's a lot of what we talked about, was how to ensure that we communicated clearly, found those developers in the places where they actually work.
Well, in any case, this should kind of wrap up how we're going to do things. It's important we have a developer site. It's important it's well documented. It's important we have a translation from the Git itself and the repos to something that's more easy to digest. A lot of the times it's because developers that may understand the Git, they need to get attracted first by either demos, which are important to have on here, or actually seeing something that's not too overwhelming and not just a raw code. So having a site like this would be helpful. Plugging in with universities, plugging in with events we talked about yesterday is important to engage, and having developer advocacy and technical writers I think is a really underserved, important part of the development lifecycle in general. So this is our plan for implementing that.